Good evening. Welcome to the 83rd installment of Eunuch Corner Club Live. It's been several months since we've done one of these because Empire of Lies has taken up a lot of my time. But speaking of Empire of Lies, my co-host Newsfist, Chris, is joining us tonight to talk to my friend Todd, Praise of Folly. Because recently, a few weeks ago, with his friend Keith, Todd had a good stream talking about why libertarianism or the libertarian identity is a non starter, a non entity, and is an absolute failure in the political arena. I thought it was an excellent stream between him and Keith, and we will be talking about that, and I'll share the link in the chat in just a second after I bring on my wonderful guest for this evening. To let you guys know, this is going to be a short discussion stream, probably no more than 90 minutes, depending on how things go. Maybe we'll go a little longer than that. I don't know. But we will be responding to all of your paid chats, whether on Entropy, Subscribestar, Tips, Cash App, PayPal, rants on Rumble, hyper chats on Odyssey. I do appreciate your financial support in this endeavor, but we won't be addressing those till the very end. So we'll make sure to pull up short if we get a lot of those in, to make sure that we can appropriately respond to the messages that come in. But barring that, we're just going to talk for the next 80 to 90 minutes about, is there anything valuable to preserve, remember, or even enshrine from libertarian thought and ideas? So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on my wonderful guests tonight, Praise of Folly and Newsfist, also known as Todd and Chris. Good evening, gentlemen.
Hey.
Good evening, is.
So before we get started, Todd, take just a moment, maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and tell people about the stream that I referenced, why you made it, what the gist of it was, and why they should check it out while I share the link in the chat for everyone.
Yes. So about a month ago, Keith Preston and I did a video on 3 kinds of socialism. And the long and the short of it is that was the result of 20 years of research on modern political history, finding all of these, what you might call glitches in the narrative, and trying to reform a coherent narrative while trying to include those glitches. And then we ended up coming to the conclusion that socialism today isn't really a meaningful term. And then I thought, well, let's be fair. Let's give libertarians the same treatment. And, we're like, okay, guys, libertarianism is also not really a meaningful concept. And there's basically 3 broad phases we covered. There was 20 years ago when libertarians were all sort of on the same page, and it looked like a unified movement was being developed. And then around 2000, the second Obama term, when the culture war kicks up again, there became the thick-thin libertarian debate. You get Hoppe on the helicopter rides with the more conservative libertarians, and then you have more leftist, socially liberal libertarians like C4SS. And that sort of culture war divide has ripped the libertarians apart. And now it's completely torn apart with Israel and Gaza, where Hans Hermann Hoppe has publicly denounced Walter Block. And Walter Block has tried himself into pretzels defending Netanyahu. So at this point, libertarianism, it kind of always was a circus, but it's just so obviously a circus now that you just can't ignore it.
Yeah. And I really did enjoy that stream. But the reason I reached out to Todd a couple weeks ago when that stream happened is as I was watching it, the thing that came to my mind was, boy, I sure do have a lot of nuance to share about this type of libertarianism, or what this speaker in libertarianism had to say on this issue, like Hans Hermann Hoppe. I really like Hoppe. We'll get into that later. So I reached out to Todd and said, hey, do you want to do a stream about this or whatever? And he was like, yeah, sure. And then when we told Chris about it, Chris wanted to get in on it. So I think that we're going to have a really good conversation on this today. So do either of you have anything you want to preface this with before we get started? Anything that bold or important comes to mind that you need to proclaim before we get into it?
Well, I guess I'll say this, right? For most people won't know this because this transition had more or less been accomplished by the time I became active online. But beginning around 2000, I would have identified as a libertarian quite strongly, because as being raised conservative, I did not like the way that the neocons were taking America with regards to all of these wars. And I'm like, well, okay, well, what is currently available that you can be both quote unquote conservative and also then be opposed to these wars? Paleoconservatism was a very, very small movement, which didn't have a lot. I mean, it was present, it was useful. But then you had libertarianism. And at that time, say from 2000 to 2008 and 9, you could say it was what was called the paleo-libertarian phase. And that's where Lou Rockwell and others were leaning into the conservative side of things. And I'm like, okay, this is kind of cool. And the long and the short of it is I no longer identified as a libertarian by 2016. That's when I debated Walter Block and Stefan Kinsella. And for two reasons. One, the culture war shifted to the left, and the libertarians all moved with it, even like the, quote, conservative ones like Mises. And I'm like, okay. There was an article called The Strange Death of Paleo-Libertarianism on VDare, where the author describes this. And then also the fact that I just didn't believe in the arguments anymore as I thought about them.
That started happening to me when I became like a properly seasoned adult, like in my late 20s. I started realizing, wait, this is just wrong. This is off. These people are feckless. They're not getting anything done. And they either, at the end of the day, they either toe the Democrat or the Republican Party line. So what's the point of this? And so I really started to become disillusioned with them by the late aughts.
Yeah, so, me too. Yeah.
Chris, is there anything you want to preface the conversation with about yourself, sir?
So I used to be sort of libertarian, but I have reached the opinion that libertarianism is retarded in a very, very profound way. Okay. So look, firstly, in my opinion, the rise of libertarianism has coincided with the rise of the administrative state, right? At the heart of libertarianism is people who just want to be left the fuck alone. However, as Todd pointed out quite eloquently, when the state is working in the favor of a certain group, right, people are fine with it, right? Like, you know, as long as the state's leaving me alone, right? I don't really care if it's, you know, it's messing you. And if it's to my financial advantage that the state is messing with you, well, so much the better, which is why you get people like twisting themselves into knots. I don't think that, I mean, I guess what's anarchism or voluntarism, the retards who think that, you know, you can have a modern country without a government. I just think that is
I don't see that happening either.
Thing of all. And I think that government is actually part of human nature, right? These organizational hierarchies are part of human nature. If for no other reason, then some people are better at leading, are better at administrative tasks, are better at military tasks than others, right? So this is what you find, for example, when
you see that in the ancient roots of European peoples. We had wise women, wise men, we had tribe elders, we had people that would form, for lack of a better term, a caucus among tribes to adjudicate certain things that are going on between tribes. The concept of government leaders is a very old one, and I think that it's not something we can get rid of.
Yeah. So look at something like, you know, communism or syndicalism or something like that. Some retarded system where everybody gets to vote on everything. Well, what actually functionally happens? What functionally happens is you immediately develop this small class of administrators, right, who follow all the politics, right, and tell people who to vote. Because, like, being a politard is a full-time job, and some people can't hack it. If everyone's like sitting around being a theory spurg, right, then, you know, who's going to build stuff? So I think that it's not that. So, you know, a lot of people, I think, Todd, you were mentioning this about the centralizing tendency of technology and stuff like that in the modern state. And I don't think that this is necessarily has to be this way. I think it is just that there is so many benefits to the centralizers from centralizing technology. So let me give you an example, right? Like, say we dumped $1 billion into making a form of government that existed on a distributed encrypted blockchain, right? Like, so something like Monero. Okay, there might be problems with it, but I'm just saying, imagine, you know, you dumped money into trying to find that out, right? You had a state that issued its money in, you know, completely anonymous cryptocurrency. You know what I mean, right? Like, if you could trust the state to develop something like that, but, you know, again, thought experiment, okay, right? You could technically have a highly technological government that is mostly, or, you know, more distributed. But at its heart, I think as long as you've got multiculturalism, you can't really have a non-intrusive government. You know, the more space there is between social mores, the more rules have to proliferate, because you can't just assume that people have a certain cultural background and be like, well, don't crap in the street, or don't, you know, just whatever, right? Like,
because the bigger the tent and the more different peoples and religions that a tent pulls into it, the more it has to forcibly regulate to make peace. And
so that's my rambling.
Okay.
piece to start with. There you go.
Well, then, to preface this for myself before we start, I would like to say a couple of things here. I, of course, come from a Maribro lower right quadrant libertarian, get off my bottom land type of mindset on things. I was raised to not trust the taxes, not trust the banks, and to be armed at all times because that's what God wants me to do, and that's what the Constitution wants me to do. I am very much an old school antebellum Maribro. That's how I was raised. I was raised staunchly Christian as well. And I come from on both sides of my family, a long time military service. So, of course, I got fed a lot of boomer truth in my upbringing. As an adult, however, I made some bad paused choices like a lot of us make along the lines of sex and drugs and degeneracy, but I got over that. And throughout my 20s, when I was making bad decisions, I started realizing that these bad decisions were being given to me by the very same people who I was supposed to vote for, who I was supposed to think had my best wishes at heart, and I learned they did not. And through my young 20s, I became very sickened by both the Republicans and the Democrats because of the war in Iraq, the lies of the media about weapons of mass destruction, the bold and blatant lies of the cover story of 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. And that is what pushed me towards alternate thought. And I found Ron Paul in my 20s. I found some other friends who were into libertarianism, into anarcho-capitalism. They got me to read some things. I didn't jive with a lot of it. I really didn't like Ayn Rand. I don't like hardcore objectivism. It just feels ugly and sinful to me. I don't like it. But long story short, I discovered that no socioeconomic structure or concept, whether that be National Socialism, whether that be American liberalism, or whether that be some kind of idealized libertarianism, I don't hold fast to any of these things. I do not identify as any of these things. I identify as someone who wants what is best for the people and the place that are being governed. And this is why I always tend towards smaller, weaker governments in multitude than large, big tent governments that span thousands of miles and millions of people that are very, very different. Because of the reasons Chris said earlier, I have seen in every system, whether it's the Roman Empire or the global anti-white empire headed by Israel and the United States, these things tend to break down with a cumbersome bureaucracy and an absolute inability to do what is good for the people they're supposed to protect and serve. So what I want to do with today is to talk about the valuable things within the libertarian camp of ideas. Things that I think should not be discounted and thrown out just because libertarians themselves are an effing mess and have nothing to offer at the table, and at worst are just henchmen of the enemy regime, which we'll get into with some talking points later. So the point of this stream today is for me to share the things that I think are good or valuable that you might want to look into or you should remember about how you should govern, how you should think, how you should participate in whatever type of power structure is around you. And I also think that it's important to remember corruption and tyranny lurks within every system. No matter how libertine or traditional that it sounds, there is always going to be human sin. There is always going to be human failings. And there will always be spiteful, evil mutants that just want to watch it all burn. So these are things that we're going to have to look out for. And so in that vein, we're going to start by going down my list of talking points I had prepared, which I did share with the other two gentlemen that came to the stream today. The first one that we're going to talk about is the big one that most of us probably discovered first early in our libertarian journey, and that is the following. I believe that fiat currency and central banking are bad. They contribute directly to a bloated, evil bureaucracy and an oppressive government that literally can do nothing but steal and enslave its subjects. What do you say, gentlemen? Do you agree with this? Do you think this is a good lesson from libertarianism?
Yeah, central banks are bad.
I think this is the part of libertarianism that I drive with the most. You know, Mises is my favorite of the sort of libertarian adjacent people. Look, fiat currency is not currency; it's forgery, right? Like, you know, the fact that people can't even realize that if it was gold and you made like a whole bunch of like fake gold out of nothing, people would be like, oh, that's counterfeit. But you know, because it's been sort of money has been divorced in the Baudrillardian sort of like sense of simulacra and simulation to be only like a, you know, a sign 4 or 5 steps removed through hypothetication to the actual underlying asset that it is meant to represent. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. And I think as well, a big reason why libertarianism has come up and why it focuses so much on currency is that I forget, somebody smart said this, that the quality of a nation's currency also reflects the quality of the morality of its people. And
Yeah.
I think this is absolutely true, because the more people you give the infinite money cheat to, the more they are just going to start doing like a bunch of like crazy stuff, like what you do when you're playing GTA 5 and you get the infinite money cheat. And you can get whatever you want, and then you start getting bored, and you're like, oh, what if we were to, I don't know, buy 1 million hookers, or make an entire staircase out of cocaine, or like just stupid stupid stuff like that.
Yeah. So Todd, what do you think about the valuable lessons of central banking and fiat currency from libertarianism? Do you think that the vilification, the demonification that libertarians lay upon central banking and fiat, do you think that's fair? Do you think that's a good lesson?
I do. I think that 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank being formed, it allows the government to finance all the things that we don't like, the wars overseas, the social programs here in the United States. And you wouldn't really be able to do that if you weren't able to produce your own money, right? Because then you have to tax people, which they don't like, which could lead to a revolt, or like the American Revolution, or you just have to save. And of course, you couldn't save money fast enough for a lot of these programs that they're working on, right? So, and there's of course the implicit moral hazard argument, right? The idea that if you have this ability to just create money, what would prevent you from creating more of it? Eventually that would lead to inflation. And then also, the first people to get the money get to spend it before it's devalued, right? So then you can sort of pick winners and losers by who gets it first, right?
Right.
All of this,
because the people that print the money do the friend-enemy distinction to give the new good money with the no interest rate to their friends, and then punish the people that are not friends by making them have the old crap money.
That's the big part of it,
yeah. So this is the Cantillon effect. And it's sort of described as a series of concentric circles with there's some fancy name for it, like the something node in the center, right? The people that can make the money, and it flows outwards in concentric circles. The first people who get it, and they pass it on to the second people who get it. And it turns out that the first people who get it, they get an effective discount, right? They effectively get sort of negative inflation, right? Because they get to buy stuff at the old price. The people that are 3 steps out, it basically cancels out. So the inflationary and deflationary effects cancel them out. And then anyone further out than 3 steps, they all get screwed. And the further out you are, the further away you are from the sort of the emitting power, the more you get screwed. So it's just a classic sort of, it is the most basic form of moral hazard you can get, because you're not only encouraged to make money, but the more money you make, the cheaper everything gets. It's crazy. I mean, at least for you,
And in my opinion, I think usury is one of the worst sins. I absolutely detest usury. It's revolting to me. I have like a spiritual rejection of it. And fiat currency and central banking, it's basically institutional usury that is forced on everyone from birth. And there's really no way to not participate in it unless you just go become a hermit and live in the middle of nowhere. And I really hate that. I think it's very ugly and wrong. And that is something that I learned from Ron Paul. I learned that from a libertarian. I learned it from other libertarian speakers and writers. And so I think that these lessons are valuable and should not be thrown out by discounting the clown show, what is libertarianism. So I think that we've fully covered my first point. Is there anything else you guys want to say about central banking and fiat currency here, or can we move on?
I only want to say one more thing. The other thing is you have to keep printing the money, because then you have to pay it back to the bank, because it's already issued with debt attached to it, right? So you actually have to keep printing it. So it's a built-in mechanism. So there's that too.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing. People now, they don't understand all money is debt. Money is not supposed to be like that, right? Like money is supposed to be an abstract, or like a representative.
It's supposed to be an abstraction that's used in surrogate for things that have real value that you can touch and see.
Or labor. Exactly. Right. Let's not forget labor. So the ultimate intangible asset, your time and your effort, right? And this is the point about using something like gold, right? You've got to actually expend energy and effort, or Bitcoin is like this as well. You have to expend energy and effort in order to mine more Bitcoin, right? So like you can't just print it out of thin air and you start sort of even if you were to like make the hugest gold mine on earth, you'd still have to employ a bunch of people. You'd still have to do stuff. There is a break. You can't just print the gold out of thin air.
Yep. So I think this is a good place to segue to my next talking point, which is actually about the conscious fighting against tyranny via voting with your wallet. And privately to me earlier today, Chris, you made a comment about this crypto and Bitcoin itself being a way that is a libertarian way of fighting against this kind of tyranny and financial corruption. So let's talk about this as the next point then. Something that I also learned that I think is valuable from libertarian ideas, again, I mostly learned this from Ron Paul growing up, is that fiat currency can be subverted. It can be ignored if enough people are willing to use another type of currency, whether this be those gold-backed dollars that have come about a few times in the last several decades, whether it be actual barter, whether it be trading goods and services directly with your community. And now, thanks to the information age, we have crypto and Bitcoin. So this is another good lesson that I learned from the libertarians is you can seek out other ways to trade instead of having to use the corrupt government's funny money. So Chris, I know you had things to say on this topic about Bitcoin. Why don't you start us off on this one?
Okay, so the point I was making to you earlier about Bitcoin is that the reason that Bitcoin works is because it is designed from the ground up with the assumption that everyone is bastards, right? There's no trust inherent in Bitcoin, right? No one has to behave like a good person for it to work. And I would argue that societies that are built upon this principle are much more stable, because the more people you have to rely upon to behave in a good manner, whatever that is, the more vulnerabilities you have in the system, right? So there's no, in Bitcoin, there's no one that you can say that there is with the exchanges, but on the actual protocol, you don't have to leave your Bitcoin with anyone and trust that they will pay you back, for example, right? So there's no need to account for people being virtuous in order for the system to work, which means it's highly stable. And I don't know what I was getting to about, well, yes, the point is that, that you can use an alternate currency, but the US government at the moment is doing literally everything in its power possible to stamp on Bitcoin, because the IMF just released a report detailing that there were significant cross-border flows in Bitcoin, something I had suspected for a while when the price started spiking. I suspected that countries were actually using Bitcoin to trade with each other to get around SWIFT and all of the, and all of just the problems of using the US dollar and using the US banking system. And of course, the US no likey. But another reason why, of course, the US no likey is that their currency is rapidly going into the toilet, right? And the more people that start to check out, the greater this effect is. The way it's usually sort of maintained is this idea of legal tender, where you force people basically through violence to pay you in this worthless currency. So you can't pay your taxes in Bitcoin. You can't pay your taxes in gold. You have to buy US dollars and then pay the government. And this keeps a crappy sort of money artificially in circulation.
Which is why I hate taxes and I hate the government. Anyway, Todd, is there anything you would like to say about Bitcoin, crypto, or alternate currencies here?
Well, this isn't directly about money, but it sort of bridges your second and third points here about resisting tyranny in a free society. So
then let's segue into that, because that's what I wanted to bring up next. And you actually mentioned to me earlier privately about anarcho-tyranny, and this is where I wanted to talk about that. So go ahead and start us off on this.
Yeah, because the thing that I think was one of the most important things was Murray Rothbard, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in order to describe how it collapsed. We're giving a sort of an explanation of how and why, because it was broadly a series of nonviolent protests, like Solidarity with Lech Walesa, and eventually a mutiny within the military. Normally the Soviets would call it the army to then quash civil unrest, but this time it didn't happen. He pointed to a 16th century work, Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, by Etienne de la Boétie, where he talks about how the idea of even a tyrant needs consent, right? People need to at least passively consent to some level for the tyrant to be in power, right? He still might rule through force. He still might rule through bribery and corruption. But again, if everybody were constantly revolting, everybody were constantly disobeying orders, it would be ungovernable, right? You couldn't actually govern. So there has to be some implicit level of consent. And so working from that work and then looking at the Soviet empire falling, Rothbard is sort of developing this sort of consent-based, non-violent system of resistance to the tyranny of the United States. And I think that particular work, Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, is extremely important, that many people should read. And related to that, too, there was a work that was written by Edmund Burke when he was very young, which he later claimed was satire, which was a critique of the state from the point of, I don't know if the word anarchism is the right word, because I don't think it really existed yet as a political ideology, but Rothbard sort of viewed it as proto-anarchic. And he basically makes a lot of points about how, centralized power uses force to conquer and dominate other people to then take stuff into the imperial core. Again, another really great essay. And these two articles, one was a book, one was an essay, I wouldn't have heard about, right, if it hadn't been for Rothbard digging up some of these really deep arcana. So in that regard, that was one of the good highlights of libertarian thought.
Okay. Chris, what would you like to say to this? Actually, I haven't spoken the point yet. We segue directly into it. The next point here is actively working towards creating a, quote, free society, in the sense of creating and maintaining systems that are both by and for the people they're supposed to serve. But we have the opposite of that now. We have a narco-tyranny where the ones who rule over us get the best of both worlds, while we get the crappiest of both worlds. And I think that in libertarian thought, they understand that those with institutional power and monopoly on violence can easily domineer and use that power to hurt the lessers. And I think that we should be cognizant of that in everything that we build, because we've seen this happen over and over again in the last, 150, 200 years. This is an ugly thing that I think people like Ron Paul and most of the libertarians that I've listened to think is something really negative about our current society, how we are given the psyops and the lies and the gaslighting every day, and we are told we live in a society, right? But then when we leave our houses, especially if we live in these big cities, it's very obvious we do not live in a society, because the people who are supposed to manage it and control it only do it for them or do nothing at all to let us suffer. So what do you think about that?
Well, we no longer live in a society, because a society, by definition, is shared values, culture, and to a significant degree, race, right? Like you can't really have a melting pot culture. I think, a few centuries from now, and maybe if all history hasn't been censored, the US experiment will probably be regarded as a massive failure and a significant reason to why it fell. In regards to your point, Todd, about the something of servitude, the permission of servitude, whatever it was.
On voluntary servitude.
Voluntary servitude. Okay, so I just to get a little Marxist there for a moment. Okay, I would say that as long as there is a certain amount of what do the Marxists call it, stability, I think, when you have sort of enough sort of economic activity to sustain people, so when you try and get the revolutionary energy going, they're like, oh, look, I can't be bothered, right? And they're like, oh, but what about the revolution? And, the person's like, oh, look, it's okay. I got a barbecue and I got my wife at home, I got a bottle of vodka, like, a week or something like that, right? This was one of the things that, the neo-Marxists like Gramsci were always banging on about like why it was that communism happened in these agrarian societies, but did not happen in the industrialized societies like Germany and England, where Marx predicted that it would happen, right? So it's only when stability gets so bad that people can't live that you then really get the revolutionary energy. And in my opinion, anarcho-tyranny is a method to achieve that, right? Terror is a political governing strategy. You see this in many regimes. The French revolutionary guys, of course, were in the first to be just so open about it. Like we're gonna rule with terror. What are you gonna do, right? Like kind of thing. But you can't rule like that forever. I think that's one of the reasons why communisms, if they survive, and I'm talking about like both the USSR and the CCP in this extent, once they go through their sort of initial paroxysm where they just go around, they just start fucking killing off everybody that doesn't agree with them. They eventually transition to a form of stability because, like they just kind of have to. Eventually, all of the young revolutionaries grow up, they have kids, they get a nice dacha, or like, and they're like, oh, and then so this is this idea of the perpetual revolution. It never pulls off. I think that anarcho-tyranny is being used as a deliberate tool in order to destabilize Western society in preparation for the next thing to come. And also, Todd, in your reference to the USSR and the fall of the USSR, did you know that Gorbachev was a massive globo homo glowy? I just found out this today, actually, when I was doing some research. One of Gorbachev's sort of side projects was the Global Charter, right? Which is like basically the forerunner of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're all like, oh, we need a global religion and everybody to be brought together and all this.
I knew he was a glowy and in bed with the GAE when he was in a Pizza Hut commercial.
Yeah, well, so I mean, so the possibly another question would be, I don't know who was Gorbachev's second in command, but if the communists had actually been in control, would they have just crushed the protests and just continued on their communist way? It seems like Gorbachev sort of willingly surrendered the USSR to the West, possibly because he really believed in this globo homo crap. But we're all going to come together as like one world, and the Americans are like, oh look, once the USSR falls, we'll totally let the Russians into NATO. We just like want one world. If he was stupid enough to believe that, then the guy's a freaking idiot.
I think he probably was. I think that he was probably made offers that were lies from American diplomats. That's probably true.
To just sort of briefly summarize all this, for those that haven't seen my video with Keith Preston on the 3 types of socialism, this is important because there's always been socialists that are very happy working with Wall Street, even though they would otherwise say they're enemies. Trotsky's a good example. And then you've also, you said Gorbachev is a good example. And then you have what you might call hardline socialists, like say Stalin, who, purges a lot of these people from the party who had internationalist connections to the West. And there's a back and forth between these two, right? I think one of the reasons why there wasn't really a hardliner, there was a hardliner coup that occurred in 91, but the military refused to go along with the orders. They just wouldn't shoot the citizen population. That's where you get the famous coup, the famous picture with Yeltsin waving the Russian flag. So part of it is even the hardliners, though, lost control of the military. And so even their coup against Gorbachev failed.
Yeah, that's a good point. So but you could make the argument. I think this is from Pareto, or Moscow, one of the two from Elite Theory, that the political formula under which the communists were ruling was basically falling apart, right? And if you've read any sort of science fiction from sort of like the late USSR, like sort of 1950s, 1960s, like the Strugatsky brothers, right? This becomes very clear, even though they're under quite heavy censorship, the message that everyone knows the experiment has failed, everyone's like bloody tired of it. If they could speak freely, they would be like, oh my God, I wish we'd never tried this. I think there's actually a book by the Strugatskys called it's like The Experiment, and they're always talking about the experiment. But in this science fiction book, the experiment is like, oh, I don't know, they've like brought in like weird monsters from like outer space or something. Russian science fiction is pretty crazy. Wait, where was I going with this? So the political formula collapses. People no longer subscribe to it, and then. And I think actually we were talking about this on the podcast last night. The only way then you can rule is through brute force. But if the instrument you are using to administer that force, like the military, if they also lose faith in the political formula, whatever that happens to be, then you're really screwed.
Yeah, exactly. And also there's, of course, the systemic problems of production, which were bringing down the Soviet economy. Which is probably why the hardliners lost credibility in the first place, right? A kind of like neo-Stalinist production was just not working. So glasnost and perestroika is in the form of reforms seems to, well, it technically already worked in China, right? Deng Xiaoping had already done this. So from the point of view of the Soviet hierarchy, they're like, well, we can manage this. The Chinese managed it, but somewhere along the line, they lost the thread.
Yeah, it's interesting actually to compare the USSR and the CCP, right? That the CCP didn't lose its nerve, right? Like, I mean, clearly Tiananmen Square, in my opinion, was meant to be like, you know, when it was 89, you know, when the Berlin Wall fell, you know what I mean? When the communists could have been like, oh, you know, that's it, we give up, you know what I mean? And the Chinese communists were like, just, you know, send in the tanks, you know, kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, look, one of the things I must stress is I think there is far too much of a reliance upon isms. And I'm not much of a communist, but there is a quote, I think it's by Deng Xiaoping, that's I don't care whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And
Right.
that is the way I feel about government, right? People are like, oh, do you want to, you know, a monarchy or a republic? I don't fucking care, right? As
Yeah.
long as it gives me a better quality of life. And I am not a utopian. I don't think there is any such thing as a perfect society. There is no such thing as an incorruptible system, because evil is not out there like the way the boomer truth regime, like, oh,
Right.
evil incarnated out there in the form of Hitler, and then we went out and we killed him, and yay Reddit, we did it, we killed evil. No, evil is in the heart of every person. So there will never be a perfect system, but you can design better or lesser systems to account for that.
Yeah.
And so yeah,
and that's one of the things I really admire about the founding fathers and the Constitution of the United States is they had problems, they had issues, they ratified a bunch of ideas onto paper, and they said, hey, we think this will be a better way, we're going to do this. And well, it went okay for a while. We see what we got, but I still think they were great in that effort, and that's an admirable effort. And I think that's what we should keep in mind going forward with the things we build, with the things that we support, with the things that we choose to share some of our resources with, to fund. We have to be careful and mindful of these things, which is why I wanted to have this discussion stream with you guys today. So speaking of that, let's move on to the next point now, which is something else that I learned from a libertarian school of thought. It is not the government's job to protect the world or to be God. It is the government's job to protect its citizens and do the minimum required to facilitate healthy trade and association of its people. So what do you think about that? Do you think that is a valuable lesson? Do you think I am off base with that? What do you think?
No, I think you're right. Todd, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm gonna dissent a little bit here. I think that the idea. So you've already made the point, Newsfist, that you can't really have a culture or a society if there's all this diversity, and that could be either ideological, religious, ethnic, right? The more the same you have, the more likely you are to have a society. And you might be able to manage one of those as diverse, but not all of them, because the whole thing just turns into mush. But I think that the government, in addition to protecting, you know, what we might call just basic rights, you know, upholding justice, I don't really accept anymore this like libertarian position that, you know, the government doesn't have any obligation to maintain a minimum standard of living for the people living in the country. I mean, part of the problem we have now is the economic resources of the government are all sent overseas to fight America's wars and prop up corrupt dictatorships, whereas, you know, they should be spent here to help rebuild the country. I mean, that was partly what the MAGA Republicans were talking about, and when they were holding up the Ukraine bill in Congress, it's still passed, but that was part of what they were talking about. And the libertarians were like, no, we don't want the government doing this. And like, well, then what is it there for, right? If it's there to protect, you know, our lives with justice, right, against individual aggression, it should also maintain a minimum level where, okay, we're all in this together. Because, you know, that's another implication of society, right? If you have neighbors that don't care about how your life is unfolding, and they just, you know, maybe you're a stoner and you got all these, you know, terrible habits and you just circle in the drain. If none of your neighbors does an intervention on you, they probably don't care about you, right? That's the thing. So if the government just sits there and watches its people that it's supposed to be acting in the interest of go down the drain like that, I don't think they really are upholding any sort of society. And so
the social contract of the leader or the ruler and the ruled is broken at that point.
Right, but there has got to be a very rigidly defined limit. So, like, religion is a good mechanism for this, right? There has got to be. So, in England, in Victorian England, right, there was a dual concept of the worthy poor and the unworthy poor, right? So the worthy poor, and you know, it's kind of quaint, but it's interesting the way this broke out, right? The worthy poor were like people who were thrust into poverty, right, through no fault of their own. You know, they were born an orphan or, you know, something like that, right? And these people were seen as, you know, deserving of help and like charity and all this kind of other stuff. And then you had the unworthy poor, you know, the gamblers, the alcoholics, the sinners. And although, you know, surely, you know, any kind of stereotype, obviously it's not going to cover everyone and people are going to slip through the cracks, right? At least a conception like that drew sort of like a hard line between the people that you thought deserved help and the people who you didn't. Look, the problem, Todd, with what you're saying is that I live in a country in the UK where the government has basically taken upon itself to pretty much do everything, right? And as much as I see Americans being like, oh, I wish we had state-sponsored healthcare, it's a fucking nightmare. Like not just because the wide variety of care depending on where you are, but also the way that the government has used this as an excuse to insert itself into all of these other areas of your life. So the UK, for example, just passed this bill saying that they're going to ban smoking entirely for anyone born after 2009, right? And their excuse for this is, well, because of the NHS, right? We can't have people dying of cancer. But we pay for the fucking NHS, right? You pay for it even if you don't use it. So this creep, right? The more
let me interject here. I also think that this is the way to walk us into fake meat and eating bugs, because they're going, what's the next thing on the list? Oh, you can't have soda anymore. We're not going to let you go to the chippy anymore. You don't get to eat the foods that you want to eat. You don't get to grow your own food anymore because now we're going to tax that and sanction that out of existence. You can't make or grow or do anything that you want to do that's normally healthy. You have to eat the bugs and live in the pod. I think that is one of the first steps towards that. And we see that the UK government seems to want to go in that direction.
No, I mean, I fully appreciate the dangers of what's going on in the UK and Canada and Australia, but I think this interesting to go back a couple years when what was it? There was an outbreak of debate between Keith Woods and the sort of like what we might call hard socialists on the right versus like the sort of like ANCAP libertarian alt-right pipeline. And then Countercurrents did a response video to this where they were trying to like navigate this debate that was resurfacing. And Greg Johnson was like, I thought we already solved this with third positionism. And I'm like, yeah, I thought that was the right-wing position, third positionism, not Marxism, not libertarianism. And a lot of, for whatever reason, it's probably too complicated to get into now, the German system, and I don't just mean, I mean, starting even as early as like the Imperial Germany and the Kaiser, this sort of mentality that the government had towards its people avoided much of the problems that you're talking about in News Fist. So I don't know what they were doing differently than, say, what's going on in the UK now. But we have an example of about 40 years of the German government taking these stances in the favor of its citizens in a more active way that didn't obviously lead to these problems. I mean, it was destroyed from without by 2 world wars.
Possibly Christianity. I mean, I don't know, man. I mean, like the sort of Prussian German sort of government before World War I was a very, very interesting beast. I mean, the right Hegelians believed that that form of government was literally perfection personified. You know what I mean? Like, Hegel's statement of the state is God bestriding the earth, right? Like, so the Germans for that period were very, very, into their government, but they were also very ethnically homogeneous. It was a highly, rigid society. It was very, very militaristic. Everything ran like clockwork. It was, when people say, the efficient German sex, that was, that's sort of, so you could make an argument that that was part of the character of the German people for it to be like that. But look, I think the other problem is that what religion is your government? Okay. Because this really matters a lot. Okay. If your government is, say, highly majority Christian, okay, and not like some creepy old millennial sort of, or, Zionist dispensationalist, like, brand of Christianity, right? But the kind of Christianity that believes that sin is always going to exist. People have their own choices. Charity is good, but you can't save everyone. and sort of, if people want to sort of like mend their ways and, come to the church and sort of reform themselves, yes, we will support that. But at the same time, we're not going to like just hold our hands out if you're going to like go and sin your life away, right? That's one point of view. If you have a government whose sort of state religion is, we're progressing, towards an omega point of like, maximum diversity, sustainability, and inclusion, right? That is just.
I've always called that the church of line go up.
Right. That is just an open door for the government to just do whatever the fuck it wants. These concepts are so vague. I mean, look, religious precepts by their definition can be vague enough, right? Especially when you've got like a set of principles, you have to get a judge to apply them. But once these concepts, this teleology towards a vague idea gets in vogue, you can twist it to literally whatever you want.
Well, then, I think that's a good point to move to my next talking point today, which is, let me clarify before I move on. The statement for that last round of discussion was, it's not the government's job to protect the world or to be God. It's the government's job to protect its citizens and do the minimum required to facilitate healthy trade and association. I don't want you to misconstrue what I'm saying here. I don't want you to think that I believe the government should provide housing and welfare and stuff like that. That's why I included the word minimum. I think that a government's job should do the absolute minimum to let the people grow and build and trade and do the things that people want to do together and be as hands-off as possible while keeping the peace and making sure that outside influences, whether military, financial, or ideological, do not come in to affect its people. I think that is and should be the only real purpose of government. So that's a pretty libertarian leaning idea there. And of course, that comes to me from my years of being sort of a libertarian person and reading libertarian stuff. So that's why I included it. All right.
Yes, one thing I want to add. I do totally agree that the U.S. should not be the world's policeman. That first part, 100% agree.
Okay. All right. Then next up, we have, let's see. That's not really something we need to talk about. That was just me putting my own thoughts down, so I'll delete that. Here we go. Here's one that I learned about, not necessarily from libertarianism itself, but on the libertarian to alt-right pipeline between like 2008 and 2014. This is what I learned, especially about race and peoplehood or folkhood. In regards to race, freedom of association, assembly, and trade is something crucial that we must not get rid of, because it is natural and healthy to want to build with, trade with, and exist with your own people while keeping outsiders at a healthy distance. We can call this freedom of association under the Bill of Rights in the United States. I'm sure that it goes by other names and concepts in different languages in different countries. But being able to, quote unquote, vote with your feet, vote with your wallet, that is a very important thing I learned from libertarian thought, especially the more alt-righty things like some Mises guys and Hoppe. I think that association with your own people, of your own belief set, of your own ethnicity, that is not just a right, but it is something natural and normal that should be leaned into. And most governments that we've known don't do that. So this is another thing that I learned and I think is valuable from a libertarian standpoint. So when it comes to freedom of association, assembly, and trade, especially through the lens of race and ethnicity, I think that's a valuable lesson that we should take from libertarian school of thought. What do you guys think?
I agree that freedom of association is important. I mean, obviously, that clause in the Bill of Rights meant two things primarily at the beginning, though it includes more than these two. One is freedom to worship. You can go to any religious institution you want to. Because in Europe, you'd be jailed if you didn't go to the state church. And then also you could demonstrate against the government, right? Because again, in Europe, if you did that, you just get arrested or shot. But this gave you the ability to protest, peacefully, picket the government and make sure and give a way to voice your discontent with the government in a way that, was short of violence. And then I think another element of freedom of association, which is interesting, this is sort of a controversial point for libertarians, but I think it's included in it, is labor organizing. So, for example, Thaddeus Russell, when he did his Renegades History of the United States, he was interviewed by some libertarian guys after he'd been interviewed by, I think it was I can't think of his name. One of the guys from the Mises Institute, so a much bigger name, and this was a smaller group. And he mentioned how unions came up, and it was Lou Rockwell, and he said, this is what Thaddeus Russell said. I mean, I'm for freedom of association, so if you want to organize and challenge your boss, I'm okay with that. That's a part of free association.
Yeah.
And he said that, the fact that Lou Rockwell and other libertarians wanted to crack down on that was inconsistent with a broader principle of freedom of association. And
I would agree with that criticism.
And I think those three are the core that are protected and need to be protected in order to speak out against any sort of actions that are harming you with externalities that you didn't consent to. And this is how you can do that without immediately starting a civil war. So that's good. Yeah.
Because like I said in one of my earliest videos, the word or the blade, for every person's idea or word you take off the table, that's a weapon that they arm under the table and they'll use it on you. Because if you give people problems, if you tell white people they're evil because of their race, if you tell men that they're toxically masculine and they're a violent rapist no matter what they do, and all this other crap that we're fed, and then you take away freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to assembly, and you give those people no out, that is a pressure cooker of violent radicalism. That is a pressure cooker of it's a ticking time bomb of domestic violence or domestic terrorism, I should say. So sure. That's why I think that freedom of association, freedom of speech are critically important to having a peaceful, sensible society.
I mean, as far as the racial angle goes, I mean, the US government is, to my understanding, like a lot of governments in the West, have literally spent many decades using the coercive violence of the state to deliberately push back against freedom of association, right? Like, as long as it's, against whites, obviously, right? Like, you can have a black only university, obviously, you can have a black only school, but, you can't have a white only school in the mistaken belief, I presume, for those who, believed in it honestly, that because everybody's the same, and because like everybody's equal, if you just mashed everyone together into this blancmange, then the rising tide would lift all boats, and all of the black students would begin attaining the same academic achievement as the white students. That doesn't seem to have happened. And I also think from a metaphysical level that is sinful and wrong-headed, because that is you deciding to be God and destroy God's creation. You want to completely overturn the natural order or the divine order and make yourself God and recreate man. That is not man's place to do. Yeah, but it just doesn't seem to be working at all, right? And ironically, this whole idea that everybody is the same is the most anti-diversity thing like I've ever heard of. Yep. Right? Like, if diversity means groups of different people who must perforce have different aptitudes and different abilities, and if you group them together, right, like, this idea of just making everybody completely the same, these interchangeable cogs, is completely against diversity. But I think for a while,
I just thought of something funny. The woke doesn't support diversity; the racists do.
Ironically, that is actually the truth. Like, because most of the racists I know, they want the Chinese to be in China and the Indians to be in India and the Americans to be in America, and they like all the different things about all of those different cultures, and they don't want this sort of globo homo sort of globo.
We don't want every crayon in the box to be light brown. We like having all the colors in the crayon box,
all the colors of the rainbow. Basically, yeah.
Well, Todd, is there anything else you want to say on this topic, or shall we move on to the next one?
I think we can move on to the next one.
Sure. The next is one of the most important ones, and this being anti-war machine, and learning the concept of what total war is. These are things that, again, I learned as a younger adult from Ron Paul, and then explored more with libertarian friends and listening to libertarian discussion. I will read what I wrote. We should be against total war. Total war is ignoble, evil. It is a thing which I personally don't think even comes from our biospiritual fabric. And it was libertarian thought, especially Ron Paul, who moved me away from a American war machine mindset and made me realize total war is evil and wrong. And I've never heard anyone in the mainstream, outside of a libertarian or two, talk about this as an evil, as a sinful thing. Discuss.
I mean, I agree. Partly what drew me to libertarians in the first place is that, I was coming out of a conservative tradition which still thought that, what Rothbard would have called the old right, right? The idea that we shouldn't go around being the world's policeman and all that stuff. I didn't know it in those terms growing up, but that's sort of what I was raised with. And so the only people, like you said, that were saying this in public were the libertarians. And to their credit, that was an important thing to say and a brave thing to say in light of the war on terror and everybody rallying around the flag and the troops because of 9/11. And so, and of course, the thing with total war is that, quote unquote, even if you do get the bad guy, right, you literally killed all of these innocent people to get to him, which is just, morally indefensible because, the principle of proportionate response, right? If somebody takes out a knife, you don't take out, a bazooka, right? I mean,
well, it'd be different if you're just using the bazooka to kill the guy with the knife. In that scenario, total war would be like, oh, that guy pulled a knife on me. I'm going to obliterate him, his family, and everyone who looks like him in a 50-mile area. Yeah. Like it's
and then what that does is it just creates more resentment against you. So other people who otherwise would not have had any intent to harm you, all of a sudden have an intent to harm you because you've harmed them without them doing any reasonable provocation.
And also both of you being Christians will probably agree with me. I also think that it's morally wrong for total war operations because you're creating war-torn shitholes where people are supposed to live. You are destroying culture. You're destroying people's way of life for whatever reason it is that you have to do your total war shenanigans. It's like, you think Iraq's going to be the same? You think Kuwait's going to be the same? You think Germany is ever going to be the same after what we did to it? No. Like, total war is an absolute moral travesty. And I think that from a moral Christian standpoint alone, every Christian should be against it.
The U.S.
But unfortunately, because of Zionism and PSYOPs, most Christians seem to support it.
The U.S. hasn't fought a defensive war since the War of Secession, or, they're always, all of the wars since then are wars in other countries that the US goes and stomps on, right? It's one thing entirely.
Also, it's not called the Civil War. It's the Secession War for Southern Independence. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I call it the War of Secession. Yeah, so
I know. I'm just being playful.
Right. It's one thing to attack someone who's kicking in your door. It's another thing to, I don't know, go 5 streets over and burn down somebody's house because your neighbor has told you that he's going to give you a whole bunch of money and to do it, right?
Your neighbor said that they're not going to use the petrodollar anymore, so you have
something like that. You know what I mean, right? Like the neighbor says he's got nuclear weapons, and so you better do it because war is a very, very tricky sort of situation, and I actually have a feeling that wars are started by certain interests in order to bring governments into their thrall, right? Because wars are surprisingly easy to start if you.
That's a highly anti-Semitic claim, Chris.
I say nothing, right?
Please continue.
And once these wars get started, right, it's quite easy to sort of keep them going if you got the right people in power. And the thing about wars is that they are a massively centralized power. Right, they bring people together in patriotic fervor, but particularly say a country like the US. But again, the US it doesn't defend its own border, and it goes over and stomps on other countries. I mean, it's retarded. I mean, the UK is basically the same, right? When was the last time a foreign army actually landed on the shores of the UK? I can't even.
Was it the
remember.
Normans?
Probably. It's been a
long
time, right?
Yeah.
Instead what happens is that they go over to other countries and they kick stuff up over there. It's wars are just a great way to get governments to borrow money.
War American machines business. Like, I think every year of my life, I'm in my 40s, America's been at war somewhere. Like, the total war machine never stops. It's just awful. It's terrible.
Well, what are you going to do with all those bases? You got to do something with them, right? Like, but it's
Well, yes. Rules of acquisition number 34: war is good for business.
Rule of acquisition 35: peace is good for business.
Yeah, that's right.
Business is good for business. Like, but yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that at least for the people, peace is good for business, right? For the elites, war is good for business. You know what I mean, right? Like, if you sort of break a class thing down like that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the business. I mean, if your business is making guns, then war is good for business. If your business is making, whereas if your business is making wedding cakes, war's maybe not so good for that. And I think it really does depend on the business, because there's a really good book called, again, full credit to libertarians here, because this is where I heard about it. The Emergence of Death came out in 1934, and I heard about it from the Mises Institute. And this guy goes through the history of arms dealing in the modern age. He goes back to the Renaissance and how it has developed, especially in the United States, because of all the independent gun makers, that really start driving it. Because in most of Europe, these are really closely associated with the state, public-private partnerships. But in America, a lot of these start off as relatively small free market enterprises that just ballooned, Winchester or Smith and Wesson or something. And yeah, I mean, these people, especially once you get to scale, they just have a demand for war, because who are they going to sell to? Who are you going to sell your guns to? Whereas if you're making wedding cakes, then no, you probably don't want a war.
Well, yeah, but also I guess as well, at least in the modern sense, and probably not just in the modern sense, when war breaks out, and particularly if the government is operating, see, this is another thing about war, is it has a tendency to flip governments into money printing, right? This is a long precedent, right? Like, you come, my king, the French, they're preparing to make war on us. Oh, well, summon the treasurer, and the treasurer's like, oh, we don't have much gold. However, I have this cunning economist who can tell us of a strategy that, we can use to make more money. And they're like, oh, that's a great idea. Let's just print, money out of thin air. And, before you know it, everything's bloody worse. And yet power has been centralized, because the government, spends all this money, and then people they rely on government contracts. And I mean, but I don't think you're ever going to get rid of war. I mean, on the other hand, right, it doesn't seem like diplomacy, at least in the West, right? Like, diplomacy is a bit of a lost art, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't see diplomats in this era really doing the kind of insanely skilled work. If I was a cynical kind of person, I would say they just fucking want war, right? Because they really don't try. I think they do. Like they're trying hard for peace at all.
I think they do, because from what I know about the U.S. government machine, it is tied to the Zionist war machine, the production of the military-industrial complex, and deep state agents, actors, and cabals in the Pentagon, in the alphabet agencies, and within Washington, D.C. itself. They want to perpetuate their power structure and their profits. And by profits, I don't necessarily mean what you and I think of, or what normal people think of as profit. What they mean is market control and petrodollar dominance. These are the tools that they use for actual power dominance. And so everyone in the machine learns that. They don't want there to be peace. They want there to be a necessary amount of conflict and war to keep America, to keep the machine rolling, and to keep that petrodollar flush, because that's what pays them. That's what their lobbyists want. Because remember, the lobbyists, they want what is good for the military industrial complex. They're the ones that pay and influence the politicians more than anyone else. So that's why I think we have this basically lack of real diplomacy, and all of our ambassadors are just spies for war. That's what it seems like.
The petrodollar really is sort of like a global legal tender mechanism
at this point,
right? Where everyone is forced to use a certain currency for a certain product. Sorry, Todd, did I cut you off?
Well, I was just going to say to use this point and others, or rather to your point, I think what we can say, though, is we can end the forever war, because before 1913, the United States didn't have a forever war, right? The forever war begins in World War I, and there's a lot of pushback. In the 20s and 30s, there was the neutrality, all this investigation into the war, attempt to maintain neutrality, which is why FDR had to provoke a direct attack by Japan. That was the only way we could join World War II, because nobody wanted to be taken for a ride again. So
don't forget just how much sympathy there was in America for what the Germans were going through in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
A huge percentage of Americans had German ancestry, German friends, and German family that lived over there, and they would correspond and talk about what was going on. So there was a massive amount of the population that did not want war with Germany. They were sympathetic to Germany at the time. And so FDR had to force us to get involved, and we all know the Pearl Harbor stuff.
Right. But the point that I'm just saying is, though, is that these are really two different questions, right? One is ending war as such, and then but one is a more narrow and I think achievable goal is ending the forever war, because that's really what we're talking about. This idea that the U.S. is always fighting somebody somewhere in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the forever war could conceivably be ended, but you'd have to completely reshape the managerial elite to do that, right?
Yeah.
It's just become so embedded at this point. Like, you know, I mean, and even in the way the US talks about itself, the leader of the free world, the exceptional nation, all of these kinds of things, like they lead very, very directly into this idea that, you know, the US has to be a global police force. And the way it's sold is, oh, we can't have other countries having spheres of influence because, you know, then we might have another world war. What, as opposed to the world war that you have been basically pursuing on a low grade level, like literally since the end of the last world war, that is about to tip us into another world war. You mean like that? It's retarded. I really think that if more Western countries had a very skilled diplomatic corps, like the Chinese, right? You got to give it up for the Chinese. They have a very skilled diplomatic corps, as do the French, right? Like there's a whole tradition of like these diplomats. They're incredibly highly trained, and they, you know, and their whole thing is to, you know, try and negotiate and get stuff like done and thus not have to go to war. There's a whole lost art that it just seems that no one's bothering to pursue because you can just, oh, well, we could just drop a bomb on them, you know, like, you know, fuck them, right?
Just drone strike them into submission like Obama. All right, let's move to the last leg now. This is what we will wrap up with, and then we can talk about other things if anything comes to mind and you feel we need to cover it. The last thing that I want to talk about that is something that I learned that I think is valuable from libertarian camp of thought. Finally, perhaps the most important thing I've gained from libertarian thought is the ANCAP Hoppian concept of total removal of hostile elements being necessary, especially when it comes to gangs, incompatible ideologies like Marxism, incompatible religions to your folk, and of course, breaking down the bureaucratic state or its agencies one brick at a time as you replace them with other better things. This is sort of twofold here. The first part is the total removal thing. I fully believe that there is nothing that the melting pot can do that will be good for us. I don't believe in the tenets of modern liberalism nor neoliberalism because of birds of a feather flock together. Your lower right quadrant or Ancapistan people are really the only camp of socio-political economic thought that I have heard address this bluntly in a way that's not like, you know, fashy, meme, Third Reich related. Hoppe especially talks about you must crush gangs and unequivocally, without mercy, remove these kind of hostile elements like organized crime and Marxoids from your area that you want to prosper. You cannot truck with it at all. You cannot allow it. You must permanently, as best as you can, keep that away from the thing that you care about, your culture, your people, your township, your city-state, whatever it is you're building. That is critically important, and I don't hear that coming from anywhere else in acceptable discourse. So I picked that up from libertarian thought, and it means a lot to me. It's the first place I detected it. And also, like I mentioned earlier, that I think is why the libertarian to alt-right pipeline is a real thing that people go through. Do you guys want to talk about that first?
Yeah, I think partly this is an extension of freedom of association.
Yeah,
because a lot of the reason why you have to put up with these elements is you're forced to.
Yeah,
right? The government either doesn't do its part of what it's part of the social contract, like fight crime, or it's forcibly integrating you. I mean, you know, again, when you have to use force, like that famous picture of the integrated schools in the South, they have soldiers with bayonets.
Because neither the blacks nor the whites here wanted to have integration. We wanted our own separate things, and everybody here was cool with that, except for a few radicals.
That's the force being used, you know, the rejection, right, of this idea of freedom of association. Now, I think there's an interesting like corollary to this, which isn't often explored, though maybe some of the older paleo-libertarians did, is the idea that when we talk about what do you actually have to have as a precondition to have a libertarian society. Because one of the things that libertarians try to do is they say, well, look, if we want to have a libertarian society, and even to some extent, Hoppe's guilty of saying this too, you know, you could be any sort of collage you want, you know, as long as you accepted, you know, a few basic core axioms. You could be like, you know, a libertarian trainee, or you could be a libertarian racist, or you could be a libertarian. I've even heard Walter Block say libertarian, Nazi, and Marxist, as long as you just, you know, LARP in your corner. But the problem is what I think this could be used for, but isn't, is like, how do you weed out libertarian undesirables themselves, right? Because there's all of these undesirables in the libertarian movement. Rothbard talked about them as the model libertarians, a bunch of like ex-Randroids that just kind of took over the movement.
Randroid is a good term. I like that.
Yeah, Randroids. And so that's an interesting turn that I don't really see them using, because you kind of have to already do that up front before you even have a libertarian society, because you have to already, you know, gatekeep and police which libertarians get in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So essentially, right, you'd have to get a bunch of the right kind of people, uproot them, and take them to a place where there was like nothing there, and get you like new society. I'm increasingly reminded these days of the kind of situations that actually led to, you know, a lot of religious groups fleeing England to America, you know, to seek the new world, so that, you know, they could, you know, found a new society unmolested and try out their new ideas. Except, of course, there's no bloody space left. You know, there's nowhere for anyone to go, unfortunately. And of course, the problem is that if you take this view that you've got to fight against the Marxists, you've got to remove all this kind of stuff, then you need a police. And the more vociferous, the larger the number there are of these people, the larger the police force you need, the more intelligence services you need, and the whole thing starts to get extremely un-libertarian very, very quickly, unless you basically combine it with a very hard sort of Schmidt, right? You make a very hard friend-enemy distinction, whether that's ethnically or religiously or culturally or something like that, right? And you'd be like, these are our people, right? Anybody else, full, you know, straight to jail, you know, essentially, right? And then you get all kinds of other problems with that. I mean, but I mean, at least if you did do that, you would have a very, very clear delineation of in-group and out-group that you could provide these different rules for. That could at least conceivably sort of work. But the side effects, at least for a while, until you manage to stabilize society, you'd have to essentially trust that all the people you gave emergency powers to would be willing to give them back once the crisis was over. And that's always a bit of a tricky supposition. You know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying. And I believe that, give me just a second. I have something for this. Let's see here. You were talking about, excuse me, that there's no place left to go. And I think that's an important thing here, because this is why I say that we shouldn't be Luddites. We should not give up technology, because it is that very technology that I think could give us an out. And of course, that out is
space.
Wow.
So,
I mean, allegedly, you know.
Anyway, I just like the space meme. It's fun. But no, seriously though, I also think that that was a joke, but it proves my point here. We want to isolate ourselves from things that we don't like. Technology can help us do that. We see that now with the internet, how we retreat into camps of people of like mind, like religion, etc. If we are to use technology for that, we might be able to, in the future, have our self-sufficient arcologies that are orbital stations or in the ocean or living in the desert, right, where there's no resources or anything, but we live in technological arcologies that have everything that we need. And then, we can use that same technology to help defend us or whatever. This is why I don't go down the Uncle Ted pill path where, eschew technology, go make a farmstead, live off the grid and all that. I view that as just kicking the can down the road and saying, well, it's not my problem. I'll be dead before it matters. Like, I think that we must not give up on technological advancement. We have to embrace it. One of the things that sets us apart from animals in the animal kingdom is our ability to envision and create technology. Other creatures can't do that. And so if we eschew that of ourselves, we are lessening ourselves to the other intelligent apes that will use that to best us and conquer us. So again, that's not necessarily libertarian stuff. That's just my personal opinion on this.
That just made me think of something, right? If Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged, right, in modern times, right, as soon as all of those business people went, missing, right, the government would like track them by satellite, right, and threaten them with drone striking if they didn't come back. They're not the spiteful mutants are not going to let the productive parts of society go. They're not just going to be like, if they may whine and bitch, 24/7 about how much they hate you and, no. If you just said, right, that's it, we're up and leaving, they'd be like, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. That's racist. That's, pick the term. So, there's going to be force involved, even if you could do that. I guess maybe you could slip out during the dead of night, but how many people could you conceivably even get away with, even if there was like a place to go, and the government would suddenly be turning up there being like, oh, you're still a citizen of this country, you must return and pay your taxes, and no. Mate. I wonder what Rand would say if she was alive today. Probably something stupid, but it'd be interesting.
The second part then let's talk about here is
Todd, what do you think about that?
About what's the first part?
No, just about like if Rand was alive today and trying to write Atlas Shrugged, and instead of the government letting all the businessmen go.
I don't know what Rand would say. I don't like you said, probably something stupid.
I mean, I'm neither a woman nor a Jew. How would I know what she would say? All right. Anyway, finally, let's get to the second part of this, which is replacing and breaking down the state stuff, the evil state megacorp, unicorp stuff we don't like, replacing that stuff one brick at a time with healthier, better alternatives. This is something I learned from ANCAPs. Hoppe talks about this, of course. All the ANCAPs do. Is you want to take away and build better alternatives to the things that government are offering. Now, obviously, this isn't going to apply to everything. You can't just go and create your own massive welfare state. But when it comes to services, goods, protections, growing crops, providing services, these are the things that people can take into their own hands and serve their community with. I love this elements of Ancapistan libertarian stuff, which is you look into the society that you're in. You look smaller around you, your state in America, or wherever what your province is or your small country is. Then you look at your local community and you say, what are the things that are bad that the government or these global megacorps do that I think is damaging my people? What can I provide that others would be attracted to in place of that? I think that is an excellent, non-violent, non-terrorist way to fight against this kind of a narco-tyranny. And I learned that from ANCAPs. I learned that from Hoppe and general ANCAP discourse. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that is a particularly libertarian thing, or is that just a capitalistic entrepreneurial thing? What do you think?
Well, I would say that that kind of thinking on a more extreme level would be agorism, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with agorism, the idea of working within gray markets.
Yeah.
I mean, see, that's the thing. This is actually why I'm a big critic of libertarianism. The idea of gray markets is brilliant, and yet no one ever seems to do it. We've had 50. I mean, Samuel Conklin III was writing in the 70s, and yet he gave these like elaborate theories of how a gray market might be implemented. The reason why you do that is you starve the government of taxes. It's because it's a form of economic activity that's very hard to account for, so the government doesn't know how to tax it, right? Partly because it's secret, partly because the exchange that's being done is very creative, and so it's hard to tax. And the idea is that you starve the government of its funding, and you know, that's a very interesting, creative, and I think thoughtful strategy. But again, like I said, the libertarians don't really go through with it.
Yeah, but it can't work if the government can just print more money.
Yeah,
there's that. Like, that assumes the government has finite resources, which,
well, it does. It doesn't, but to a point, it does, because if the money printer goes burr long enough, everything starts to fall apart.
Well, here's the thing, right? Even if they have a money printer, right, you could theoretically argue that as more and more productive activity is moved outside the Overton window of the Eye of Sauron, they're going to have less to work with. Because right, the power that they have is in large part because they can control these large economic conglomerates, which then they can direct, right? Because it's not just taxing it, it's also directing economic production. So, for example, the Forever War, right? They can just direct all of this economic production towards the military-industrial complex because it's visible to them, right? If you take it off the table, you know, cast a spell of illusion, right, Yiz? So they can't see it. Then it's a lot harder for them to redirect.
It's a third or fourth level spell, depending on your class, called non-detection. It makes you immune to scrying effects. Yes,
that's right. Yes.
So, I wanted to bring that up because I didn't know if you guys think that that's a particular libertarian idea or not, but it is a very critical one to the way I think on life and how people should behave and what we should invest in and build together. And I learned it from ANCAPs. So I didn't know if that was a particularly libertarian idea or not, or if that's just something that is part of that kind of libertarian thinking. But I've really only heard this from ANCAPs talking about it. So
to be fair, I've heard this from anarchists as well.
Okay.
And I mean,
ANCAPs are a type of anarchist, so that makes sense.
It's a broad dissident theory that is slightly different based on the dissident talking, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's a broad theoretical base of dissidents that would accept the principle. They just would have different flavors based on what they're going to emphasize.
Yeah. And I'd like to let it be known, I'm not an anarchist because I'm not a child. I understand how life works and how people are. And everyone wants order. Everyone wants a king. And very rare is the man who actually can be or wants to be a king. People enjoy the fruits of a well-ordered and organized system. Whether you want to call that a government or a monarchy or whatever. So I'm not an anarchist. I don't want there to be no government, no law at all. That just sounds like living in an African shithole to me. I don't want that. But I do think that we should aim towards an appropriate government structure for the people, for the time, and where we are at. And I don't think that these massive bloated mega states with their huge militaries and oppressive everything, I don't see that ever being good for us, even if we were the ones to control it and kick out all the foreigners. I would still want to minimize the government and tear down 90% of the U.S. FedGov, even if everything else was peachy keen. I would still want there to be less invasive government and less invasive policies and practices. So I guess maybe I'm sort of more of a, I don't know, I hate to label myself anything, but like minarchy, like minimalist government is maybe a better thing.
I have to say this now, yes. If you're going to label yourself, you're going to have to read Hunger the Die Merchant in 3 hours and 19 minutes when he commented. I'm no longer a libertarian. I'm simply the supporter of the nation of Israel.
Very good, very good. Well, that's a good. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just going to say, as far as the grey market thing goes, right? I think that's already happening. This is one of the reasons why the government's trying to institute central bank digital currencies and crack down on crypto and all this kind of stuff, because the burdens have now gotten so onerous because this combination of a sort of weird teleological utopian kind of like idea from the state combined with a lack of understanding of what the goddamn Laffer curve is seems to just there's so many things going on at the moment with the government that are very clearly producing diminishing returns, right? Like, you know, so the more you push it, the less it gets, right? Like, so taxation's like that, right? Like, once it hits a certain point, you stop. Every single increase actually nets you less and less and less money because it becomes cheaper for people to just, you know, hire a lawyer or, like, you know, move offshore or whatever, right? So just there is an argument that shrinking the size of government would actually in many ways produce more taxation, because if you just had a flat tax and everyone paid like, I don't know, crap, like 15% on everything, right?
And
That's
you
not-
had 80% less government employees to pay. The government would have more funds, right?
Exactly. And then people like, well, it's only 15%, right? Like, you know, it's too much of a hassle to get around. You'd actually have more people, you know, paying for it. But it's the lefties, man. They're just they're crazy. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You
That's
got
okay. I was just about to wrap things up. I had a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for joining me to humor me about these points and talk about these ideas. Todd, thank you for having that wonderful stream on your channel that inspired this stream. Thank you very much. I do highly recommend that you guys look at that stream. It will be in the pinned comment underneath this this stream when you re-listen to it, not live. And of course, you can find the link to both Newsfist and Todd's channels in the description of this video, wherever you are listening. And I highly recommend that you go and check these gentlemen out. They both make excellent content. We will be back, Chris and I, Thursday night for Empire of Lies. Definitely don't miss that. And before we get out of here, we had one paid message come in, and it is from our aforementioned good friend Hunger Merchant over on Entropy. For $20 US. Thank you so much, Hunger. I really do appreciate that. Hunger says, friendly reminder that I emphatically support the beautiful nation of Israel. Off topic, but one question for you and Todd. Can you explain the phenomenon of the Hicklib? What is it that makes them so revolting? Well, a Hicklib around here is someone that we call someone who is like a mix of a hippie or a dirtbag lefty, who is also still kind of a hick and likes fishing and hunting and shooting guns and stuff. But they're all about, oh, free love, man. Race doesn't matter. You know, I don't believe in God because I don't believe in oppression. Like that's a hicklib to me, is somebody who basically espouses every single neo-lib talking point, but still sounds and acts like a hillbilly that lives around here with me. That's what it is to me. And I find it revolting.
So basically a hippie who likes guns.
It's a hillbilly hippie, basically, to me. But I mean, I'm sure there are hicklibs of other types, like in the Midwest and places like that. But now, thankfully, there aren't many hicklibs around here, well, we might have a murder rate higher than 0. I'll just say that. Anyway, that was the last paid chat. That was the only one of the night. Thank you so much, Hunger, for funding this lovely stream between me and friends. We will be back, like I said, Thursday night. And thank you all for joining me. This was an interesting conversation, and I look forward to more of it in the future. So any closing thoughts from you two gentlemen?
No, just thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks both of you. It was a good stream.
Well, I'm glad to facilitate, and hopefully we'll have more good talks in the future. So God bless everyone, and good night.
Good night.